I've always loved coming to Maine for hunting season. There's something about the crisp November air, the quiet woods, and the chance to escape the noise of everyday life that draws me in every year. Normally, I stay at an Airbnb because buying a place for one annual trip doesn't seem practical. So, in November of 2022, like clockwork, I packed my rifle and gear, booked a cabin near a national park, and made the long drive from the city. It was a 5-hour drive through dark, winding roads, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was well past midnight. I was tired, but the adrenaline of getting back into the wilderness kept me going. The cabin was small, a rustic little place tucked away just beyond the tree line. It was perfect for a hunting trip, remote enough to feel isolated but still within a short drive of the national park. The owner had left the key under the doormat as promised, and after fumbling with the lock in the dark, I stepped inside. The cabin was simple: one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a wood-burning stove. It smelled of cedar and pine, the kind of earthy, welcoming scent that immediately made me feel at ease. I set my bag down, took a quick look around, and decided I'd explore more in the morning. After a long day of driving, all I wanted was to collapse into bed and get some rest. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the woods outside the cabin window. I brewed a cup of coffee, grabbed my hunting gear, and headed out, eager to get a good start on the day. I had a general idea of where I wanted to go, having scouted the area online beforehand. There were supposed to be good deer populations near a trail a few miles from the cabin. As I made my way through the woods, I could hear the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful. I'd been walking for about an hour when I heard something behind me. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer. But when I turned around, I saw a man. He was older, maybe in his 60s, and wearing an old, worn-out jacket and a hunting cap. But there was something off about him. He wasn't carrying any hunting gear, just standing there, staring at me. "You can't hunt here," he said, his voice rough like gravel. I was taken aback for a moment. "I'm sorry, I thought this was public land," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm. "Not anymore," he said. "This area's off limits now. You need to leave." The way he said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a demand. Something about his tone made my skin crawl, but I nodded, not wanting to start a confrontation. "All right, I'll head out," I said, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. He didn't say another word, just stood there, watching me as I turned and walked back the way I came. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced over my shoulder. He was still standing there, staring after me, unmoving. I picked up my pace, eager to put some distance between us. I made it back to my truck, deciding to drive to another park nearby. The whole encounter left a bad taste in my mouth, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just some local who didn't like out-of-towners hunting on what he considered his land. Either way, I didn't want any more trouble. By midday, I returned to the cabin for a quick break, but something was wrong. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I distinctly remembered locking it when I left that morning. My mind raced. Had I forgotten? Or had someone else been here? I stepped inside cautiously. The cabin was quiet, but as I looked around, I saw that things were out of place. The chairs at the small dining table had been moved, and my bag, which I had left in the bedroom, was now on the floor, its contents partially spilled out. My wallet, phone, and other essentials were still there, so it didn't look like anything had been stolen, but the unsettling feeling from the woods returned with a vengeance. I checked every room, every corner of the cabin, but there was no one there. Whoever had been inside was long gone. My mind immediately went to the man I'd encountered in the woods. Could he have followed me? Had he broken in while I was gone? I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure before heading back out to continue my hunt. But the rest of the day, my focus was gone. Every sound in the woods felt like it was someone watching me, lurking just out of sight. The peaceful solitude I had come to enjoy felt different now, tainted by the unease that was creeping under my skin. By the time the sun began to set, I hadn't seen a single deer. I decided to call it a day and headed back to the cabin. The sky was a deep orange as I parked the truck and made my way inside. Everything looked as I had left it, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I tried to shake it off. I had a beer, made myself some dinner, and eventually started to relax. But as I prepared for bed, a noise stopped me in my tracks. It was subtle, just the faintest creak coming from the bedroom. I froze, listening intently. It came again, another quiet creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. I walked slowly toward the bedroom, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle I had propped up against the wall. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pushed open the door. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The bed was made, my bag was still on the floor where I had left it. But then I saw it, something small, but unmistakable. The closet door was slightly ajar. I stood there for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. The closet door, which had been closed the last time I checked, was now cracked open just enough for me to see the darkness inside. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Someone had been in my cabin earlier. I was sure of it. But was it possible that they were still here? Hiding? Watching? I slowly reached for the rifle, my hands trembling slightly as I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to the closet, trying to silence the pounding of my heart in my ears. The creak of the wooden floor under my boots sounded deafening in the quiet cabin. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. No answer. I reached out with my free hand and grabbed the edge of the closet door. With a quick motion, I yanked it open, the hinges letting out a low groan. And there, crouched inside, was the man from the woods. He was hunched over, his eyes wide and wild, the same dirty jacket wrapped around him. For a moment, neither of us moved. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, waiting for me to find him. I pointed the rifle at him, my hands shaking as adrenaline coursed through my veins. "Get out," I demanded, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't move. Instead, he just stared at me, that sickening grin still plastered on his face. My finger hovered over the trigger, and I was ready to do whatever it took to protect myself, but then, slowly, he stood up, raising his hands in mock surrender. I stepped back, keeping the rifle trained on him as I reached for my phone with my free hand. I dialed 911, my heart racing as I explained the situation to the operator. The man just stood there, his grin slowly fading into something more menacing, like he was toying with me. The operator told me that officers were on their way and to stay calm. Stay calm? I thought. How could I, with this man standing just a few feet from me, his eyes locked onto mine like a predator watching its prey? Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, the rifle heavy in my hands, never taking my eyes off the intruder. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening for any sign that help was on the way. Finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens. The man's grin faltered for the first time, his eyes darting toward the window as if considering his next move. But before he could do anything, the sound of footsteps on the porch told me the police had arrived. "Don't move," I ordered him, my voice stronger now. The door burst open, and 2 officers rushed in, guns drawn. They quickly subdued the man, who didn't resist, just kept that unsettling stare locked on me until they dragged him outside. I sank onto the bed, my body finally releasing the tension I had been holding onto for what felt like hours. The officers asked me questions, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was how close I had come to, what? I wasn't sure, but it scared me more than I wanted to admit. As the police car pulled away with the man in the back seat, I couldn't help but wonder how long he had been watching me, how long he had been planning this. And though I was relieved to have the gun, it was the unsettling realization that stayed with me, the thought that he had been waiting in that closet, hidden in plain sight, watching, waiting. I never found out how he got into the cabin, or what his intentions had been. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't coming back to Maine anytime soon. It was winter in northern Michigan, and the world outside our cabin was blanketed in a thick layer of snow. I was 14 at the time, excited for my first hunting trip with my dad and cousin, Sam. We were hunting deer, something I'd been hearing stories about for as long as I could remember. In my mind, hunting was a rite of passage, a moment that would mark my entry into adulthood. We had driven up early that morning in our beat-up old truck, hauling our gear and an ATV strapped to the back. The air was biting cold, and everything felt still, as if the world had frozen in time. We parked the truck and loaded up the four-wheeler, which rumbled and sputtered through the snow-covered trails until we reached the hunting ground. It was a remote area deep in the woods, far from any signs of life except for the occasional animal tracks. The day had started slow. We set up camp in a small hunting blind, huddled together in the cold, hoping to catch sight of a deer. Hours passed, the silence only broken by the occasional crack of a branch or the whisper of wind through the trees. I kept my eyes peeled, my heart pounding in my chest every time I thought I heard something moving. But nothing came. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the snowy landscape. "It's getting late," my dad said, his breath clouding the air in front of him. "We should pack up and head back before it gets dark." Sam nodded, already starting to stow his gear. I followed suit, packing away my rifle, somewhat disappointed we hadn't seen anything. But at least I had gotten the experience. As we began to move out of the blind, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it had become. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I was the last one out, lagging a few steps behind my dad and Sam as they headed toward the ATV. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of snow behind me. At first I thought it was just one of us stepping on a patch of ice. But then it happened again, this time louder. I stopped, my breath hitching in my throat, and glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the woods, dimly lit by the fading light. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was probably a squirrel or some other small animal. We were in the middle of the forest, after all. Animals were everywhere. But as we continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The crunching sound started again, this time louder and closer. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned fully around, scanning the trees with my flashlight. My dad and Sam were still ahead, their backs to me, not noticing anything out of the ordinary. That's when I saw it. There, in the snow, was a set of fresh tracks. They were large, too large to belong to a deer or any other animal I could think of. The tracks looked like they had been dug into the snow, almost as if whatever had made them was dragging its claws. I felt a chill run down my spine, and not just from the cold. I called out to my dad, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, there's something out here." He didn't hear me at first, so I hurried to catch up with him. My heart was racing now, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I could hear the crunching again, closer this time, following me. Panic began to set in, and I broke into a jog, trying to reach my dad and Sam as quickly as possible. My flashlight beam danced across the trees as I ran, my boots crunching in the snow with every step. That's when I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for years to come. It was a scream, guttural and raw, echoing through the woods like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It was somewhere in between, a terrifying mixture of a bear's growl and the anguished wail of a person in pain. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The scream was so loud, so close, it felt like it was right behind me. I forced myself to move, to run, even though my legs felt like they were made of lead. I yelled for my dad and Sam, my voice barely cutting through the terror that gripped me. Finally, I reached the clearing where the ATV was parked. My dad and Sam were already there, their faces etched with confusion as they looked at me, wide-eyed. "What the hell was that?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "But we need to go." "No." They didn't argue. We jumped on the ATV, and my dad revved the engine to life. The roar of the motor drowned out the eerie quiet of the woods, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But as we sped down the trail, heading back toward the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure, impossibly tall and gaunt. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but the silhouette was unmistakable, easily over 10 feet tall, with long, bony arms that hung at its sides. Its skin, if you could even call it that, was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. I blinked, hoping I was just seeing things, that it was some trick of the light. But it didn't disappear. It just stood there, watching us as we sped away. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought the urge to scream. We made it back to the cabin in record time, the ATV skidding to a stop outside the door. I jumped off, feeling the bile rise in my throat as the fear overwhelmed me. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up, the adrenaline finally catching up to me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the snow, trembling uncontrollably. My dad ran over, concern etched across his face. "What the hell happened out there?" I could barely speak. All I could do was point back toward the woods, my voice shaking. Something followed us. He looked at me like I was crazy, but there was no denying the fear in my eyes. Even Sam, who was usually the first to brush things off, looked unsettled. We locked the cabin door that night, and I didn't sleep at all. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing in the woods, about the scream, about the tracks, and the figure I saw standing there, watching us. Whatever it was, I knew it wasn't an animal. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over. I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach, the events from the night before replaying over and over in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, tall, gaunt, and looming at the edge of the woods. My dad was already up, sipping his coffee by the cabin window, staring out at the trees like he was trying to convince himself that what I had described couldn't be real. Sam, on the other hand, had barely said a word since we got back. He just sat in silence, his usual carefree demeanor replaced with a distant, unsettled look. "Are you sure you weren't just seeing things?" Dad finally asked, breaking the silence. His tone was cautious, like he was trying not to scare me more than I already was. I shook my head, still feeling the icy grip of fear in my chest. "I know what I saw, Dad. It was huge, way bigger than any animal out here. And that scream. You heard it too, didn't you?" He looked away, frowning. "I heard something. Could have been a bear or a mountain lion, maybe. Sometimes they make noises like that." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to accept that it was just a bear, that my imagination had run wild in the darkness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Something about those tracks, those glowing eyes, it was unnatural. Sam finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go back and check it out." My heart dropped. The thought of going back into those woods, of seeing that thing again, made my skin crawl. "Are you crazy? I'm not going back there." But Sam wasn't backing down. "We have to. If there's something dangerous out there, we need to know. For all we know, it could be stalking the cabin right now." My dad sighed, rubbing his temples like he had a headache. "Look, we'll go back during the day. Whatever it was, if it's still out there, we'll figure it out. But we're not staying another night in these woods." That afternoon, after some convincing, we geared up and headed back out. I was reluctant, every step through the snow sending a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through me. My stomach was in knots, and I kept glancing around, expecting that thing to jump out from behind a tree at any second. The air was still cold, but this time it felt different, heavier. Like something was lurking just out of sight. We retraced our steps to the spot where I had first noticed the tracks. My flashlight beam cut through the dim winter light as I crouched down, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The tracks were still there, but now they seemed even larger in the daylight, the deep grooves in the snow suggesting something with claws. "Jesus," Sam muttered, staring down at the tracks. "That's no bear." We followed the trail further into the woods, the crunch of our boots the only sound breaking the eerie silence. The tracks led deeper than we had ventured before, into an area that felt wrong. The trees grew closer together here, their branches hanging low as if they were trying to trap us. The light was dimmer too, the thick canopy blocking out what little sunlight there was. Then we heard it again. That scream. It was distant this time, but unmistakable. The same gut-wrenching, bone-chilling sound we'd heard the night before. My blood ran cold, and I instinctively reached for the rifle slung across my back, gripping it tight. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I whispered back, my eyes darting between the trees. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs felt glued to the ground. Dad stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low but steady. He was trying to stay calm for our sake, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something he'd ever dealt with before. We continued following the tracks, though every step felt like we were walking into a trap. The further we went, the louder the screams became. They echoed through the woods, distorting and blending with the wind until it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. And then we saw it. In the distance, maybe 50 yards ahead, something moved between the trees. It was tall, taller than I remembered, with long, spindly limbs that looked like they shouldn't be able to support its weight. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky motion, as if it didn't belong in this world. I could barely make out its face, but what I saw made my stomach lurch. Its eyes, those same glowing eyes, stared directly at us, unblinking. Sam let out a string of curses under his breath, his hand gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "But we're leaving. Now." We turned and started walking back, trying to stay calm, but the thing, whatever it was, began to move. It followed us, its long limbs allowing it to cover ground faster than we could. My heart pounded in my chest as we picked up the pace, the crunch of snow underfoot growing more frantic. I dared to glance back once, and I wished I hadn't. It was closer now, moving faster. Its limbs twisted and bent in unnatural ways, like it was running but didn't quite know how. The glowing eyes never left us, locking onto us like a predator stalking its prey. Panic set in. We broke into a full sprint, the trees blurring past as we ran for our lives. I could hear it behind us, the thudding of its massive feet and the snow growing louder, closer. My lungs burned with each breath, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare stop. The cabin finally came into view, and I pushed myself harder, practically throwing myself toward the door. Sam and Dad were right behind me, and we all burst inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it behind us. We stood there, panting, listening. The woods outside had gone silent again, but the tension in the air was suffocating. My mind raced, trying to process what we had just seen, but there was no rational explanation. No way to make sense of the creature that had stalked us through the woods. Dad grabbed his rifle, loading it with shaky hands. "We're not staying here. We're leaving now." We packed up everything we could carry in a hurry, my heart still pounding in my chest. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty woods. By the time we got back to the truck, it was dark again, and the sense of relief that washed over me when we finally drove away was overwhelming. But the feeling of safety was short-lived. Even now, years later, I can still feel it, the shadow that lingers, watching, waiting. I never went hunting again after that. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in those woods. Not after what we saw. My dad still doesn't talk about it, and Sam refuses to acknowledge it ever happened. But I know. I know what we saw, and I know it's still out there, lurking in the dark corners of those woods. Waiting. I'll never forget that Friday evening. It was one of those crisp autumn nights where the air had a bite, but not enough to be uncomfortable. The type of night that promised adventure, especially for someone like me, a 13-year-old kid eager for my next hunting trip. This particular trip felt special. My dad, Grandpa, and I were heading to our family's old hunting ranch in Alice, Texas. A sprawling 300-acre piece of land that had been passed down for generations. I'd been going there since I was 4, so every tree, every dip in the land, felt familiar. It was home, in a way. We arrived late in the afternoon, just before the sun dipped below the horizon. As usual, we parked the truck near the main cabin, a modest wooden structure that looked out onto acres of wild, untamed forest. I could smell the scent of pine and damp earth mixing with the faint whiff of barbecue smoke from our dinner earlier. We unloaded our gear, rifles, camo jackets, binoculars, and prepared for the next day's hunt. But before any hunting trip, there was always the tradition of sitting around the campfire. My grandpa, Jack, had already started the fire by the time I unpacked the last of my things. The crackling flames danced, casting long shadows across the open field, and the three of us settled into our usual spots, beers for them and a soda for me. Grandpa, with his thick white beard and weathered skin, told his usual stories of hunts from his younger days, when deer seemed bigger and more abundant. I listened, half engaged, because I'd heard these stories countless times before. It was peaceful, just the three of us and the sounds of the woods surrounding us. That kind of quiet where even the slightest rustle in the bushes could catch your attention. And that's when it happened. A sound pierced the night, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a scream. But not human. It wasn't an animal either, at least none that I knew of. It was high-pitched, guttural, almost like a woman wailing in agony mixed with the deep growl of a predator. My heart jumped into my throat. "What the hell was that?" I asked, looking wide-eyed at my dad and Grandpa. They both sat frozen, their faces as confused and concerned as mine. "Could be a mountain lion," Dad muttered, although even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. "No way," Grandpa replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I've hunted mountain lions before. That ain't no mountain lion." The scream came again, this time closer. My skin crawled, and my mind raced with possibilities. What kind of animal could make a sound like that? And why was it so near? We grabbed our rifles and flashlights, the light beams cutting through the thick blackness of the forest edge. We stood, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. But nothing followed. The scream had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the crackling fire and the whisper of the wind through the trees. After a long, tense moment, my dad shrugged, trying to shake off the unease. "Maybe it was a fox or something. Let's not let it ruin the night." But I couldn't relax. That scream stayed with me, ringing in my ears, even as the hours passed. We eventually went to bed, but I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind brushing against the windows made me jump. I kept thinking about that sound, about what could be out there in the dark woods, watching us. By morning, I was exhausted, but the hunting trip had to continue as planned. The next day, we woke up before dawn, the sky still inky black. My grandpa and dad went their separate ways to different blinds, while I was assigned to the one furthest from the cabin. My stomach churned with anxiety as I trekked through the underbrush with my rifle slung over my shoulder. Alone. I'd never been afraid to be out here before, but now, every rustle, every distant snap of a twig made my pulse quicken. That scream was still fresh in my memory, and the thought of whatever had made it was enough to make me second-guess every step I took. Finally, I reached my blind, an old wooden platform that sat high in a tree. I climbed up, settling into the small space, and set my rifle on my lap. I scanned the dark horizon with my night vision binoculars, expecting to see the usual, maybe a deer or a wild boar. But as the minutes ticked by, there was nothing. Not a single animal in sight. That was strange, considering how active this area normally was. I was about to chalk it up to bad luck when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, slow, deliberate. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was standing on 2 legs, but it didn't move like a human. Its posture was wrong, hunched and awkward, like it was struggling to stay upright. My heart pounded in my chest as I focused the binoculars, trying to get a clearer view. The figure was heading toward the tree line, just beyond the clearing where I was sitting. And then, suddenly it stopped. It turned its head toward me, and even though I was far away, I could feel its gaze. Cold. Hollow. Malevolent. Then it screamed. The same horrific, gut-wrenching scream from the night before. I froze. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with terror. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. Once. Twice. Then I just kept pulling the trigger, the sound of gunfire ripping through the quiet morning. The figure didn't fall. It didn't run. It just vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, like it had never existed in the first place. I sat there, panting, my heart slamming against my ribcage. My hands were slick with sweat, and my rifle felt heavy, too heavy, in my trembling hands. I waited, hoping that whatever it was wouldn't come back. But all that greeted me was silence. When my grandpa and dad finally returned to the cabin later that morning, I could hardly speak. My words came out in a panicked rush as I tried to explain what had happened, the figure, the scream, the shots I fired. I half expected them to brush me off, to tell me it was just my imagination running wild after a long night of strange noises. But instead, my grandpa's face went pale, and my dad's expression turned grim, like they knew something I didn't. For a long moment, the three of us stood there, the morning sun creeping higher into the sky, casting light on our tense little circle. My grandpa, who was usually the first to crack a joke or make light of things, stayed silent. His eyes were distant, staring into the trees as if he was looking for something, or maybe remembering something. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I heard that scream before," he said, not looking at either of us. "A long time ago." A chill ran down my spine. My grandpa wasn't the type to scare easily. He'd fought in wars, hunted in the wildest parts of the country, and lived through more danger than I could imagine. But there was something in his voice now, something I'd never heard before, fear. Dad looked at him sharply. "What are you talking about, Pop?" Grandpa sighed and sat down on the porch steps, his rifle resting against his knees. "It was years ago, back when I was about your age," he said, nodding toward me. "I was out here with my dad, your great-grandpa. We used to come up to this ranch every hunting season, just like we do now. But one year, something happened." He glanced at me, his eyes dark and serious. "We were sitting by the fire one night, just like last night, when we heard it. That same scream. We thought it was an animal, too, but it didn't sound right. It was too human. So, we went to check it out." I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up as he spoke. Grandpa wasn't one for ghost stories or tall tales, so the fact that he was telling me this now, with that haunted look in his eyes, made my skin crawl. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "We didn't see anything, at first. But we kept hearing that scream, closer and closer every night we stayed here. Finally, one night, we spotted something out in the woods, just like you did. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. It was too tall, too thin, and the way it moved, it wasn't right. We tried to shoot at it, but no matter how many rounds we fired, it never went down. And then, just like that, it was gone." My dad crossed his arms, clearly trying to keep his cool, but I could tell he was rattled too. "So what did you do?" he asked. "We left," Grandpa said simply. "Packed up and didn't come back for years. Not until I figured it was safe again." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The figure I had seen, was it the same thing my grandpa had encountered all those years ago? And if so, what the hell was it? Some kind of spirit? A creature? My logical mind wanted to dismiss it as a coincidence, maybe a hallucination brought on by fear, but deep down, I knew it was real. I had seen it. I had heard it. And it was still out there. "So what now?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What do we do?" Grandpa stood up slowly, his joints creaking with the effort, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. "We go hunting," he said, his tone grim but determined. But this time, we stick together. The three of us geared up, more solemn than usual, and headed back out into the woods. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the landscape, but the air still felt heavy with unease. We moved quietly, scanning the tree line, listening for any sign of movement. The forest was eerily still, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. Hours passed with no sign of the figure. I started to wonder if maybe it really had just been a bad dream, some figment of my imagination fueled by nerves and lack of sleep. But then, just as we were about to turn back, I heard it again. That scream. It was louder this time, closer, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. My grip tightened on my rifle as I turned to face the direction it came from. The woods seemed darker now, even in the daylight, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the area with my binoculars. There, just beyond the clearing. The figure. It was standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden by the shadows. It looked just as it had before, tall, thin, with an unnatural posture that made my skin crawl. But now, I could see it more clearly. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty, dark pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, frozen, staring at the thing that shouldn't exist. And then, without warning, it started toward us. Slow at first, then faster, its long limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions. "Shoot!" my dad shouted, and the three of us raised our rifles and fired. The gunshots echoed through the woods, but the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, faster now, until it was almost upon us. Panic surged through me, and I fired again, this time aiming for its head. The bullet hit, but it didn't go down. Instead, it let out a deafening scream, louder than before, so loud that it made my ears ring. And then, just like last time, it vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. We stood there in stunned silence, our rifles still raised, waiting for it to reappear. But it didn't. The woods were silent again, but this time, it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that made your skin crawl, the kind that told you something was very, very wrong. "We need to go," Grandpa said, his voice shaking slightly. "Now." We didn't argue. We turned and hurried back to the cabin, our hearts pounding, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the figure didn't show itself again. Not that day, and not in the days that followed. We packed up and left the ranch that afternoon. None of us said much on the drive home, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with us. And I had a feeling that next time, we wouldn't be so lucky.